The sound of Philadelphia was built on sweeping strings, smoky horns, and voices so powerful they could make a stranger feel understood. For over 2 decades, it was the most sophisticated, most emotionally resonant music in America. But behind the orchestras and the chart positions, some of the voices that built that sound were carrying private weights that no string arrangement could lift. Tonight, 10 Philadelphia soul stars, their greatest songs, and the tragic ends their stories came to.
Close the door.
Number 10. Billy Paul. Paul Williams. Born in Philadelphia on December 1, 1934. He spent over 2 decades working clubs, jazz venues, and the edges of the music industry before Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff signed him to Philadelphia International in the early 1970s. 2 decades of grinding work produced a voice built not from studio tricks, but from genuine lived experience. Rich, deliberate, slightly worn at the edges in exactly the right way.
Me and Mrs. Jones.
In 1972, Gamble and Huff wrote Me and Mrs. Jones with a collaborator known around the office simply as Hippie.
I know she'll be there.
The song treats an extramarital affair not as scandal, but as emotional truth. 2 people meeting at the same cafe every day, both knowing it's wrong, neither one willing or able to walk away from it. Leon Huff said simply, "The best songs are real stories." Billy Paul himself said before the record was even released that he knew it was a hit because it was the kind of thing everyone could relate to, even if they'd never say so out loud.
Holding hands.
He was right. The record hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in December 1972, held it for 3 weeks, topped the R&B chart for 4 consecutive weeks, and won Billy Paul the Grammy for Best R&B Vocal Performance, Male in 1973. At 38 years old, after more than 2 decades of work most people never saw, he had finally broken through in a way that matched the talent he'd been carrying the whole time.
Up too high.
What followed was the industry's attention moving on almost immediately. He kept recording 15 albums of deeply socially conscious music that Questlove later called one of the criminally unmentioned bodies of post-revolution civil rights soul.
'Cause she's got
He performed in the UK and Europe for decades, where Philadelphia soul had devoted followings that American radio hadn't manufactured but couldn't kill. Billy Paul died in Philadelphia on April 28, 2016, at 81 years old. 1 Grammy, 1 immortal song, and a catalog the mainstream never properly came back for. Number 9. Harold Melvin.
You should understand me.
Harold Melvin formed the Blue Notes in Philadelphia in 1954 when he was 15 years old. Over the next 2 decades, he rebuilt the lineup multiple times, kept the group working on the club circuit, and refused to quit even when the national breakthrough never arrived. And then he made the single decision that changed everything. He moved Teddy Pendergrass from the drummer's seat to the front microphone.
When I come home a little late at night.
With Pendergrass's raw, urgent, physically overwhelming voice at the center, and Gamble and Huff's sweeping orchestral production around him, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes signed to Philadelphia International in 1972 and released If You Don't Know Me By Now, written specifically to exploit Pendergrass's ability to convey desperate emotional need. He delivered every line as though the other person understanding him was literally the only thing keeping him together. The record hit number 1 on the R&B chart, reached number 3 on the pop chart, and earned a Grammy nomination for Best R&B Performance by a Duo or Group. It became one of the most beloved soul records of the decade.
1974.
Then Pendergrass left in 1975 for a solo career and didn't look back. Harold Melvin rebuilt the group with new lead singers and kept recording. But every new recording was measured by listeners against what they remembered from before. the commercial momentum never returned to what it had been. The Blue Notes without Pendergrass were a genuinely talented group, performing in the long shadow of their own former best. Harold Melvin suffered a stroke in 1997 and died on March 24th of that year, at 57 years old. The group he had founded as a teenager outlasted him. His story ended in the city he had started from, far younger than his tenacity and persistence deserved. Number 8. Norman Harris. If you have ever heard a Philadelphia soul record from the 1970s, any record from any artist on the Philadelphia International label, you have heard Norman Harris's guitar. He was one of the primary session guitarists of MFSB, the house band that played on virtually every significant record the label produced throughout its golden years. Most listeners never knew his name. They just knew the sound, because it was on everything they loved. MFSB's Love is the Message, a sweeping, building orchestral soul instrumental running nearly 10 minutes, became one of the defining recordings of the entire Philadelphia era and one of the most sampled records in hip-hop history. Norman Harris's guitar gave that record, and every other PIR release he played on, its characteristic shimmer and forward motion. He was also a producer, working with the 3 Degrees, Blue Magic, and other Philadelphia acts on material that extended the Philly sound beyond what the main label roster was producing. He suffered a heart attack and died in June 1987 at 43 years old. His passing received almost no mainstream attention because that is what happens to session musicians. The audiences who dance to their work for a decade rarely learn their names until the work is already finished. Without Norman Harris's guitar, the sound of Philadelphia would not have sounded the way it did. The strings and horns receive most of the credit in most accounts of this music. But the guitar made the records move, and the man behind the guitar was gone at 43, while the records he made kept playing. Number 7. Thom Bell. Thom Bell grew up in Philadelphia, played piano as a teenager alongside a young Kenny Gamble in a local doo-wop group, and eventually became the man most responsible for the lush, orchestral branch of Philadelphia soul, the sound that ran through the Delfonics, the Stylistics, and the Spinners in the early 1970s, and defined a specific emotional register that no other producer of the era came close to matching. Betcha by Golly Wow, produced by Bell for the Stylistics in 1972, is the clearest example of what only he could do. He built records around arrangements of near-classical sophistication, cellos, oboes, French horns, and voicings that sounded more like a film score than a soul single, and placed vulnerable falsetto vocals right at the center of all that orchestral richness, creating something simultaneously grand and deeply intimate. The song hit number 3 on the pop chart and number 1 on the R&B chart. It became one of the most covered recordings of the decade. Phyllis Hyman's rendition on Norman Connors's album helped launch her own career. It has never stopped being recorded. Bell's catalog with the Stylistics, the Spinners, and the Delfonics represents the most consistently sophisticated body of production work to come out of Philadelphia's golden era. In his later years, he moved to the Pacific Northwest, stepped back from active production, and faced significant health challenges, including vision problems, that limited his ability to work in studios. He died on December 22, 2022, at 79 years old, just 5 months after William Hart of the Delfonics, the man whose falsetto he had first helped shape into something extraordinary. 2 architects of the same sound, gone within the same year. If you're locked into this one, most people scrolling past these songs have no idea what it took to make them. Groove Lens digs that history back up, one record at a time. The subscribe button costs nothing, and it means you won't miss the next one. Number 6. Gerald Levert. Gerald Levert was born in Philadelphia on July 13, 1966, the son of Eddie Levert, lead singer of the OJs, which meant he grew up inside one of soul music's most celebrated legacies, attending rehearsals, watching his father work, absorbing the language and discipline of the music from childhood. Alongside his younger brother Sean and childhood friend Mark Gordon, Gerald formed the trio Levert in the 1980s. In 1987, they released Casanova, a slick, confident R&B track delivered with the kind of easy swagger that made it sound effortless, even though Gerald was only 20 years old when it was recorded. It hit number 5 on the pop chart and number 1 on the R&B chart, earning 2 Grammy nominations and establishing Levert as one of the defining R&B acts of the late 1980s. What Gerald's audience didn't know was the chronic physical pain he managed privately for years. He had developed health problems that required prescription pain management, Vicodin, Percocet, Darvocet, medications that, combined and accumulated over time, created a dangerous load on his system. On November 10, 2006, Gerald Levert was found unresponsive at his home in Newberry Township, Ohio. He was 40 years old. The coroner ruled his death the result of acute intoxication from a combination of prescription and over-the-counter medications, an accidental overdose, not a deliberate act, but one that asks serious questions about chronic pain, prescription practices, and the absence of adequate safeguards for artists who live at the intersection of physical suffering and public performance. His father, Eddie Levert, who had spent decades on record celebrating love, family, and resilience, buried his 40-year-old son. Gerald Levert's memorial was attended by thousands. The music he left is still played. And I just got to let you know. Number 5. Sean Levert. 16 months after Gerald Levert died, his younger brother Sean was dead too. Sean Levert was born in Philadelphia on September 28, 1968. He had grown up alongside Gerald in the same musical household, formed Levert with him and Mark Gordon, and built his career around the group's shared identity. When Gerald launched a successful solo career in 1991, Sean continued working to keep the Levert name alive in various formations, finding new partners, trying to rebuild what the three of them had built together. The two brothers remained close until the end. At Gerald's funeral service in November 2006, Sean stood beside his father Eddie Levert and sang "Dance with My Father," rewriting the lyrics to speak directly to Gerald's memory. People present described it as one of the most devastating things they had ever witnessed in a public setting. By early 2008, Sean had pleaded guilty to 6 counts of failure to pay child support, totaling approximately $85,000, and was sentenced to 1 year and 10 months in the Cuyahoga County Jail in Ohio. He was already dealing with high blood pressure and serious health issues when he entered custody. On March 30, 2008, less than a week into his sentence, Sean began hallucinating in his cell. Emergency assistance was called. He was transported to Lutheran Hospital in Cleveland within the hour. He died there at 11:57 p.m. at 39 years old of complications from sarcoidosis, an inflammatory lung disease combined with heart disease, high blood sugar, and drug withdrawal. So please don't say you're leaving. Two brothers from the same family, both gone before 16 months apart. Eddie Levert had buried 2 of his children. There is no song lyric adequate to that weight, only the silence left behind it. Number 4. Blue Magic. Blue Magic was a Philadelphia vocal quintet. Ted Mills, Wendell Sawyer, Keith Beaton, Richard Pratt, and Vernon Sawyer, who recorded for Atco Records and were produced by Norman Harris and Bobby Eli, working within the broader Philadelphia soul orbit without being direct members of the Philadelphia International family. Their sound was unmistakably Philly. Lush, layered, falsetto-driven harmonies over orchestral string arrangements. But they operated as a parallel current to the main PIR roster. Sideshow, released in 1974, is one of the most emotionally affecting records to emerge from the entire Philadelphia era. It uses the metaphor of a circus sideshow, people paying to stare at the unusual, the broken, the different, as a framework for one of the loneliest feelings a person can carry, being the object of everyone's attention without being the recipient of anyone's love. There's got to be no sadder show to see. Ted Mills's lead vocal rides that metaphor with complete sincerity, and Norman Harris's production wraps it in exactly the right orchestral warmth. The song hit number 8 on the pop chart and number 1 on the R&B chart. The tragedy of Blue Magic is one of gradual erosion rather than a single dramatic event. Follow-up records received diminishing label support. By the early 1980s, the group had fragmented. Vernon Sawyer, a founding member, died in 1994 at a relatively young age. Ted Mills spent the following decades keeping the Blue Magic name alive through various lineups, performing for audiences who remembered the group's brief, brilliant peak. He died in 2021 at 80 years old, a man who had made one of soul music's most perfect records and then spent 47 more years as its keeper. Number 3. The Delfonics. Before Philadelphia International, before Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff had built the machine, before the sound of Philadelphia had a name, there were the Delfonics. William and Wilbert Hart, two brothers from North Philadelphia, and Randy Kane formed as a group in the mid-1960s, and in the winter of 1967-68, walked into a recording session and created one of the founding texts of what Philly soul would become. Let me try. Let me try. La La means I love you. Produced by Thom Bell and Stan Watson and released in 1968 on the Philly Groove label, is built on William Hart's impossibly delicate high falsetto, a voice so pure and so vulnerable it seems to exist at the exact frequency where beauty and heartbreak become indistinguishable. The song hit number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100 and went gold. It established the orchestral, falsetto-driven template that the Stylistics, the Spinners, and eventually every major Philadelphia soul act would build from. There is an argument, a strong one, that without the Delfonics doing this first, none of what followed exists. William Hart was the voice, the writer, and the creative center of the group. He spent the following decades trying to rebuild the Delfonics' commercial presence, keeping the name alive across changing rosters and changing musical landscapes, carrying something precious that the industry had moved on from. He died on July 21, 2022, at 77 years old. Thom Bell, who had produced his most celebrated work, died 5 months later, in December of the same year. The two men who invented the sound, together, gone within months of each other. The music they made is still playing. They are not. Number 2. Phyllis Hyman. Phyllis Linda Hyman, born in Philadelphia on July 6, 1949. She came to New York City in the early 1970s. and was spotted singing at a club by producer Norman Connors, who cast her on his album You Are My Starship in 1976. Her version of Betcha by Golly Wow on that record announced a voice that was immediately and unmistakably extraordinary. A deep, rich contralto with enormous range, emotional intelligence, and a quality of sorrow that lived underneath every note she sang, even the joyful ones. She eventually signed to Philadelphia International Records and released material throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. The Prime of My Life, in 1991, gave her a first #1 R&B hit with Don't Wanna Change the World. But the mainstream superstardom her talent warranted had been redirected.
Promise that you'll stay.
Clive Davis at Arista had positioned himself to make Phyllis Hyman that kind of star, then decided to invest those resources into a singer named Whitney Houston instead. Phyllis Hyman carried that knowledge for the rest of her life. She lived with bipolar disorder and depression. She used alcohol and cocaine to manage what other interventions couldn't fully reach. She was lonely in specific, documented ways. She spoke with disarming honesty in interviews about the difficulty of finding real love, about the gap between the warmth she gave audiences and the isolation she felt when the concert ended. In 1993, her mother and grandmother died within the same month. On June 30th, 1995, 6 days before her 46th birthday, she took an intentional overdose of barbiturates in her apartment. She left a suicide note. She was due at a soundcheck at the Apollo Theater that afternoon. When her assistants forced their way in, she was already unconscious. She died 2 hours later. A posthumous album released later that year was titled, I Refuse to Be Lonely. The title reads now as the saddest possible summary of everything. Number 1. Teddy Pendergrass. On the night of March 18, 1982, Teddy Pendergrass was driving home from a charity basketball game in Philadelphia. His Rolls Royce left the road and struck a tree. The impact damaged his spinal cord permanently. When doctors delivered the news, he was 31 years old, and his career had just reached its highest point. Theodore Derice Pendergrass had started as Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes drummer, been moved to the front microphone when a lead singer failed to show, and then gone solo in 1976 to release 5 consecutive platinum albums, a record for any solo artist at the time.
Let's bring this day to a pleasant end.
Close the Door from 1978 is the fullest expression of what he could do at his peak. A slow, intimate invitation delivered by a voice so confident in its own power that the record sounds less like a performance than a private communication. It hit number 1 on the R&B chart and remains one of the defining records of the entire Philadelphia soul era.
Let me rub your back where you said it's sore.
After the accident, Pendergrass could still sing, but the signature power that had made his voice physically overwhelming was permanently diminished. The baritone that had packed arenas was thinner now, still recognizable, still genuinely beautiful, but fundamentally changed. He returned to the stage at Live Aid in 1985, performing from his wheelchair, and the crowd's response made clear that what he represented, survival, presence, refusal to disappear, mattered to people who had loved his earlier records. Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff were on vacation in Jamaica, writing songs for Teddy's next album when they saw the accident reported on television. Gamble said later, "When Teddy's car hit that tree, it broke the heart of Gamble and Huff." Pendergrass founded the Teddy Pendergrass Alliance to support others with spinal cord injuries and spent 28 years in a wheelchair turning private suffering into public purpose. He died on January 13, 2010, at 59 years old. The Congressional Record of the United States includes a formal tribute to his life. He earned every word of it. 10 artists who built one of the most beautiful sounds in American music and paid for it in ways the music could never show. The strings are still playing. The voices are still there. Go find the songs. Listen to them, knowing what it cost to make them. And if these stories matter to you, subscribe, because there are more where this came from.